All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. We're looking at how one of history's most notorious monsters might actually be its most misunderstood victim. I mean, you've seen her face, right? She's everywhere. From ancient pottery to high-end fashion logos, the woman with venomous snakes for hair, whose very gaze turns men to solid stone. But what if the story we've been told for centuries is entirely upside down?
So, before we really get going, I want you to think about a fundamental question. Is the woman cursed with snakes for hair really just a beast that needs to be slain? Or is she a survivor whose story was completely stolen? As we'll see today from our sources, which range from classical literature to clinical social work and modern discourse analyses, Medusa's narrative has been totally hijacked.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the monster we know, then look at the trauma behind the myth. After that, objectified by art and science, parallels to PTSD, reclaiming the narrative, and finally, inked as empowerment.
Okay, Section 1. The monster we know, pop culture's favorite villain. You know, modern video games and movies constantly minimize her to a one-dimensional obstacle. Think about Clash of the Titans, both the 1981 and 2010 versions. Her defeat is literally just popcorn spectacle. Or in games like Castlevania or God of War, she's just a boss fight, right? A creature to conquer so the player can feel awesome. Even in Smite, a game that actually bothers to acknowledge her painful backstory, she's still played as totally unsympathetic. Across the board, all the way down to that ubiquitous Versace logo, she is completely stripped of her humanity.
We are so accustomed to the triumphant hero story, right? Perseus seeking glory, proving he's the man. But if we flip the script and look at the survivor's narrative, a totally different picture emerges. It asks us to look at a human being enduring immense trauma, living in total isolation, and dealing with constant, violent intrusion by men who are literally trying to kill her.
Moving on to Section 2, the trauma behind the myth, Ovid's account. To really understand the survivor's side, we have to look back at the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses.
The crucial point here, and this is heavy but absolutely vital to the context, is that her story starts with a horrific act of sexual assault. Her agency is stripped away from the very beginning. The ancient texts tell us she was the only mortal of the three Gorgon sisters, and famous for her incredible beauty. But she caught the eye of the sea god Poseidon, and the assault happened right inside the sacred temple of the virgin goddess Athena. Medusa didn't ask for this, she didn't provoke it, and she certainly had no power to stop a literal god.
So how does the myth resolve this massive injustice? Well, instead of punishing the perpetrator, Poseidon, the victim gets the blame. Athena is furious her temple was desecrated, but she directs all of that fury right at Medusa. This is basically ground zero for the cultural erasure of her pain. She's physically transformed into a horror. Her best feature, her beautiful hair, is turned into venomous snakes, and she's exiled, totally isolated.
That brings us to Section 3, objectified by art and science, the evolution of an image.
Over the centuries, artists continually manipulated her image to fit whatever cultural ideology was trending, completely ignoring the human underneath. In the classical era, she was a symbol of protection. Fast forward to the 16th century, and Renaissance guys like Cellini and Caravaggio are obsessing over her macabre, decapitated head just to hype up Perseus's victory and the triumph over evil. Later, the late 18th century romantics saw her as this beautiful terror, where beauty and the sublime intersect. But notice the pattern? Across all these eras, she's just an object to be used, never a subject to be understood. Let's zoom in on that first era for a second. Even when she was considered a protective symbol in antiquity, she was still reduced to a terrifying object. They called it a gorgonion. People slapped it on ovens, roofs, and famously on Athena's own shield, the Aegis. The logic was to scare away evil by reflecting evil back at itself. But you know, that just locks her permanently into the role of a monster. And honestly, this trend of objectification carried right on into the realm of early psychology.
Case in point. In 1922, Sigmund Freud wrote a famous essay where he just completely yanked Medusa out of her narrative context. By analyzing only her decapitated head, Freud essentially re-decapitated her. He completely ignored her internal world and her trauma and focused exclusively on what she meant for the male psyche, theorizing that the snakes somehow mitigated castration anxiety for the male onlooker. Once again, Medusa is reduced to a tool to explain male experiences. When modern scholars look at her legacy today, the discourse generally splits into two camps. Misogynist interpretations de-emphasize her power, casting her as a demonic threat or a femme fatale. On the flip side, feminist interpretations highlight her power, seeing her as a righteous representation of female rage. But, as our sources point out, we have to be careful, because even some of these empowering readings can accidentally gloss over the very real human trauma that started the whole thing.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Parallels to PTSD, a clinical social work perspective. If we look at her behavior through the clinical lens of trauma experts, Medusa's monstrous traits are actually a brilliant, uncanny illustration of the involuntary, defensive symptoms of PTSD. Her petrifying gaze, that maps perfectly to hyperarousal, an extreme, intense startle response to perceived danger. The intrusion symptom is mirrored by all these men constantly breaking into her isolated cave, forcing her to reenact her trauma. And constriction, that numbing paralysis of the mind, is literally materialized by the frozen stone corpses scattered all over her floor.
Look at this quote from psychoanalyst Robert Bosnak. It really highlights how Medusa was trapped in these endless, disjointed relivings of her trauma. A flashback isn't a memory you can casually narrate. It's a fragmented, involuntary jolt that completely derails your present. Medusa turning men to stone isn't an act of calculated evil. It's a trauma survivor stuck in an endless loop, totally unable to process what happened to her into a cohesive life story. She is stuck.
Which leads us into Section 5, Reclaiming the Narrative, the Loving Gaze.
So how do we actually help trauma survivors move past those fragmented flashbacks toward healing? Philosopher Adriana Cavarero offers this truly beautiful concept. By offering a survivor the loving gaze, basically seeing them as a whole person without judgment, clinicians can help them safely reclaim their role as the narrator of their own life. It's about seeing someone past their defensive walls, looking beyond the monster they might feel they've become, and just acknowledging their fragility. Now, apply that idea to the climax of the myth. Perseus uses his mirrored shield to approach Medusa. Our sources present a super fascinating alternate reading here. What if, in that mirror, Medusa finally saw herself? If we reframe that ending, Medusa seeing herself in the mirror isn't just her defeat, it's a moment of profound agency. It's the Medusa effect, the exact moment she transitions from an object being looked at to a subject seeing herself, showing a willingness to finally be seen.
And finally, Section 6, Inked as Empowerment, #MeToo and Tattoo Culture.
To understand this modern cultural shift, the sources lean on Roland Barthes' theory of semiotics. It perfectly explains how the modern Medusa tattoo strips away the old monster narrative and builds a brand new meaning. In Barthes' terms, the first system is just the literal image. A woman with snake hair equals Medusa from Greek myth. But the second system empties out that monster trope entirely and repurposes her image as a powerful new signifier for surviving sexual violence and reclaiming power.
Driven largely by viral trends on platforms like TikTok, the Medusa tattoo has become a massive beacon for #MeToo survivors to publicly reclaim their bodily autonomy. It takes the concept of écriture féminine, feminine writing, and applies it straight to the skin. By getting this tattoo, survivors are actively rejecting the male-dominated narrative where they're just defeated beasts. Instead, they transform their pain into deliberate, beautiful art, communicating a shared experience of survival without ever having to speak a single word.
We've seen how centuries of art, literature, and even early psychology turned a victim into a monster. They trapped her, objectified her, and used her as a prop to make heroes look braver. But modern reclamation is finally giving her voice back. The Medusa tattoo doesn't isolate the person wearing it. It connects them to this huge, supportive community of survivors who instantly recognize the symbol and the immense strength it takes to wear it.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought, and it really forces us to confront our own preconceived notions. The next time you encounter Medusa, will you look away from the monster or will you hold the gaze of the survivor? It makes you wonder, how many other monsters in our myths, or even in our daily lives, are actually just survivors waiting for someone to finally listen? Thanks for diving into this explainer with me today.
Knowledge grows through sharing. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe as we continue to grow together.